Hi, I'm Lawther, and in this presentation, we'll review some basics of Google Polymer. By the end of this presentation, you should have an understanding of what Polymer is, how to get started building a basic app, the structure of a basic Polymer app, and some of the pros and cons of using Polymer. You won't have a full understanding of the ins and outs of Polymer, but you should have a starting point to building your first app and be able to have an educated conversation about the library. What is Polymer? From Google, this is their description. Polymer is a lightweight library that helps you take full advantage of web components. With browsers, you can create reusable custom elements that interoperate seamlessly with the browser's built-in elements or break your app up into right-sized components, making your code cleaner and less expensive to maintain. Polymer sprinkles a bit of sugar over the standard web components API, making it easier for you to get great results. More simply, Polymer is an open source JavaScript library for building web applications using web components. Web components are a set of W3C standards and upcoming browser APIs for defining your own custom HTML elements. Web components are self-contained elements that can have its own HTML, JavaScript, and CSS separate from the DOM itself. Polymer streamlines the process of implementing the web component standard and adds cross-browser support. Public development for Polymer began in November of 2013, and release 1.0 was made available in 2015. The latest stable release version is 1.8, and version 2.0 is in the release candidate status as of January 2017. As mentioned previously, Polymer uses web components as one of the foundational pieces for building apps. The challenge with this is that web components are future technologies, meaning that the standards for web components aren't solidified and browsers support them at varying levels. Does this mean that Polymer is only useful for the most modern release of web browsers? Of course not. Polymer is compatible everywhere. Polymer accounts for the current functionality of web browsers and uses JavaScript libraries to account for the gaps. Allow me to illustrate with this visual. Let this represent the native functionality of browsers. Browsers have a varying level of support for the different parts of web components. Polymer is able to fill in the functionality gaps of various browsers by providing a set of foundational JavaScript libraries that are collectively known as polyfills. Polyfills are made in JavaScript and allow functionality that you'd expect to work in modern browsers, future browsers, or older web browsers to work in your application. As an example, the property session storage is available in IE8 and upwards, but isn't available in IE7 or below. A polyfill can be used to fill the support gap for older browsers that don't provide support for this property. As a developer, you can now depend on this polyfiller to provide an API and not have to feature test the code to handle different browser scenarios. Another part of the intent of these polyfills is to encapsulate the changes of new browser functionality so that the code does not have to be refactored continuously. Core provides the necessary infrastructure for Polymer elements to use the capabilities provided by the native and foundation layer. The final pieces are the elements. Elements intend to serve as building blocks that help create complex applications. The elements also encapsulate complicated browser APIs, CSS layouts, and UI components and prevent them from bleeding into other parts of the application. Now that you understand the structure of how a Polymer app looks, let's take a high-level look of how to get started building a Polymer app. To get started with Polymer, it's best to start with the Google-provided documentation at polymer-project.org. On the Polymer project home page, you can select Try It Now and Install the RC, which is Install the Release Candidate, referring to the pre-release version of Polymer 2.0. There you will find two options. I recommend option 1, using the Polymer CLI. Using this method will build the app structure, including a working index.html with a custom web component. An important item to note is that this install relies on Node Package Manager to install the Polymer CLI, and Polymer itself heavily utilizes the Bower Package Manager. make sure to familiarize yourself with those if you're unsure how to use them or what they do. Once the project is initialized, the next step is to start adding web components. A variety of web components are available at webcomponents.org. On that page, you can search through different web components and start adding them to your site. It's important to read through the documentation of the web components that you want to include on your project. Because anyone can publish a web component to the repository, there's a varying degree of documentation and success with each of these components. A good rule of thumb is to use the components that have more stars on GitHub. These usually represent components that are used more frequently and are known to be stable. Installing is as simple as running bower install web component name from the root of your project folder. For this demo project, I've installed the app layout web component, which is actually a collection of components. To demonstrate how to use these web components, I've included a simplified sample of my index.html code. I've excluded a few things that are either repeated content or part of the standard HTML content. The first thing you'll notice at the top of this page are the web component imports. You may recall that I only installed one web component, but that it was structured as a collection of web components. Meaning when I added the one new web component to my project, it added multiple web components that it depends on. On webcomponents.org, there is a dependency section on the documentation of each web component. If dependencies are listed, you can expect that multiple web components may be imported with one bower install statement. On my index.html page, this is why there are more import statements than it appears web components that I am using. Some of these, such as iron icons, are actually a dependency of another web component. The next section I have called out is the custom web styling component. This section of code is basically applying some custom CSS to a web component that I am using. In this case, the app toolbar web component. This is an example of how the documentation for a web component can become very important. Some of the defaults don't provide any coloring. If coloring is not specified, it may show as a white on your screen, and with a white background, it may not appear as though anything is there. The final section highlighted is the use of web components. This is where part of the magic of Polymer can be seen. To build a basic toolbar for my application with some custom buttons and actions, this is the only code I need. I'll show it on the next slide. Essentially, I am specifying my content as I would a basic HTML tag, such as h2 or a div tag. When I run my application through the Polymer serve command, this is what the start of my application looks like. This took me about 10 minutes to import all of the web components and add them to my index.html file. To do this with raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code, it would have taken me several hours to do. In conclusion, learning Polymer has been a great experience and has some great pros and cons. Some of the pros include the UI development was very fast. I was able to build the application that I demoed within a few minutes, shaving a great deal of time off of my development cycle. Next is the encapsulation of the JS, CSS, and HTML components on my UI. It's very frustrating when developing a UI to make a change to a UI component and have it unintended consequences across the whole page. Finally, Polymer allows for extensive use of web components today. Without the polyfill libraries, it could require extensive work to take full advantage of some of these features that web components provide. Some of the negative things I didn't like included the difficulty that can be involved in building custom elements and the varying amount of documentation available for some of the published web components. Some of the published components were absolutely wonderful and helpful. Some other hardly had any information about how to use them. The last part I didn't care for is the overhead associated with some of the polyfills. Though small, it can negatively impact performance, especially on mobile browsers. This concludes my presentation on Polymer. I hope you were able to learn something. Here are some of the sites that I referenced.